We will be right now.
Oh, was I too quick to shut that
Yep,
down?
it's okay.
I can do it again. Greetings and welcome, everyone. It's so good to see you. My name is Amy Antonucci. I'm the chair of the board of New Hampshire Peace Action, and I'm really glad to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion and question and answer period for the film, The Movement and the Madman. I want to welcome our panelists. We have executive producer Robert Levering, producer director Stephen Talbot, and activist and friend of ours, David Hartsough, who appeared in the film. Let's pause though and start our evening with an acknowledgement that we here in New Hampshire do our work on the Udakina, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Wabanaki, and Pennacook peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land, the waterways, and the people who have been in relationship for so many generations. Just a little reminder and update on our kind of Zoom protocol. We love it when you have your video on. We are recording though, so we understand if you don't want that. Your audio will be muted to start with. Pretty soon we're going to be getting into Q&A, so we have the chat box and also the hand raise function, and we'll call on people one at a time for with your questions. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to say a little bit about our panelists, and then each of them will have a chance to say a few words before we get into the conversation. What I didn't ask earlier is if one of you wants to go first. Should I introduce all of you or one at a time? Do you guys have any okay, then I'll just go ahead and say something a little bit about each of you. You had much longer bios. I had to shrink them down, but we are really glad here to have executive producer Robert Levering. I hope I'm saying your name right. Journalist who has written dozens of articles and authored 8 books. He also founded the Great Place to Work Institute, a global research and consulting firm. He was on the new mobilization staff for the November 15, 1969 demonstration and was a staff organizer for other national anti-war actions. We also have producer-director Stephen Talbot, an Emmy, DuPont, and Peabody award-winning filmmaker who has produced, written, or directed over 40 documentaries. He has frontline films. His frontline films include The Best Campaign Money Can Buy, Justice for Sale, and News War, What's Happening to the News. As a student at Wesleyan University, his very first documentary was a film about the November 1969 anti-war protests in DC. And now for David Hartsough, again, a longtime peace and justice activist and friend to New Hampshire Peace Action and many, many other groups. He is the author of his memoir, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. He's co-founded, to name a few things, World Beyond War and the Nonviolent Peace Force, and has traveled the world organizing peace efforts and helping to build nonviolent movements. And he has actually been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience in this work more than 150 times. So that's a little taste of the interesting folks that we have here joining us for our conversation tonight. And again, I want to ask each of you to say a little bit about this project, about, you know, your involvement in it and what that means or you know, has meant to you. And I'm not sure which of you wants to go first. I can call on you, Or yes, Robert, go
Yeah,
for
I'll
it.
go first.
Great.
It's my idea. Anyway, you mentioned earlier, I think before we started it formally, another film called The Boys Who Said No. And it was one that a group of about a half dozen draft resistors, including me, did. And the idea of that film was really to give, do a film about the draft resistance movement, the Vietnam anti-war draft resistance movement. And I thought that while we were doing it, I was very concerned about, well, what about the overall anti-war movement? There are, until our film was made, there'd been no films that really describe the full breadth and depth of the anti-war movement. And I think that the thing that really tipped it for me was Ken Burns's The Vietnam War, the 18-hour, 10-episode documentary that PBS showed. And of the 18 hours, much less than 1 hour had to do with the anti-war movement. And even the parts that were in it sort of carried through the caricatures that have happened ever since, which is that, it stressed the violent incidents that happened. It showed sort of the weird things that happened. And and it basically poo-pooed the impact and effect of it. And I guess you could say it sort of pissed me off. This is just not right. And we really need to have something out there that really does describe the full anti-war movement and how impactful it was. Now, as a problem, the anti-war movement involved millions of people, hundreds and probably thousands of organizations, big and small, and it went on for more than 10 years. And unless you had enough money, let's say like the, I don't know, it was $20 to $30 million that Ken Burns had with the Bank of America and other kinds of sponsors like that, impossible to do. So the idea that was, how to focus it, how to focus on something that could be told that would sort of represent the rest of the movement. So Dan Ellsberg is somebody that I and other, David certainly knew him very well, talked a lot over the years about how the demonstrations in 1969, the moratorium and the mobilization, had such a big effect on Nixon and Kissinger that actually, and what Dan always said was that it helped to avert World War III, or not necessarily World War III, but the use of nuclear weapons. And as much as I love Dan, I wasn't really sure that was true. But after doing a fair amount of research, there's really quite a bit of evidence that that was true, that there's a lot of things had come out in the 40 to 50 years since the war was over that really showed that we really did have that kind of impact. So that was the idea, was to focus on that 1 year, 1969, and what happened in that year. And so I have to say that I did an absolutely brilliant thing, which was to hire Steve Talbot to be the director, because Steve not only is a terrific, has all this background and so on as a director, 40 films and, awards and so on, but he was there. He actually participated, so had no problem of trying to help communicate. And he also had this feeling that the anti-war movement really needs to have have the full anti-war movement actually shown as a film. So Steve, why don't you take it from there?
Okay, Robert, thanks. Yeah, Robert is the one who got this whole thing started, and I'm very glad he did. And as he mentioned, I'm a Californian, born and raised in Los Angeles, and have lived here in San Francisco for well over 40 years now. But I went to college in Connecticut, to Wesleyan in Middletown. And in 1969, was a senior, and I was very active in the anti-war movement in the area, and was one of the leaders of the October 15th moratorium in Middletown, where we had a march down Main Street in the town. It was the first time we'd gotten off campus with our anti-war activities. And it was very successful. We involved church leaders, local politicians. The president of the university actually for the first time came out for immediate withdrawal of US troops in Vietnam. So it was a big success. It was a big high. And then we were all kind of dazzled about how huge it was across the whole country. None of us, I certainly was not prepared for that. So I then noticed that the next month there was going to be this big march in Washington. And I decided that I would go with my best friends to take part in the demonstration. But I was also a senior. I had to do a thesis. I was an English major, but I'd gotten very interested in documentary filmmaking. There was a small program then at Wesleyan. And so I gathered up the film equipment that we had and went to Washington in a U-Haul van with about 10, 12 people. And we spent the whole week in Washington before, during, and a little after the demonstration, and we filmed it. And that became my thesis film. I graduated from Wesleyan with that film, which I called March on Washington. And when Robert showed up and started talking to me about this film, I thought, I have this 16 millimeter black and white film from over 50 years ago. Maybe we could use that. And sure enough, we did. There are clips from that film in The Movement, The Madman. So Robert's right. I had this activist and early filmmaking experience in 1969. And this was a chance to go back and revisit what we'd done, to look at it in a new, broader context, and to make a film that was told really from two sides, from inside the White House, showing what Nixon and Kissinger were up to, as told by aides who were working for them at the time. And then, of course, from the perspective, the viewpoint of the anti-war movement, which had no clue. We had no clue what Nixon and Kissinger were doing at the time secretly, what their plans were, which was a massive escalation of the war, as you saw in the film. That's what they were planning in that fall of 69, including, as Ellsberg says, the threats to use nuclear weapons. Resume the bombing in North Vietnam, bomb the dikes, absolute disaster. And those two demonstrations, the moratorium and the mobilization in the fall, stopped that from happening. So we thought that was an incredible story that needed to be told.
Thank you, Stephen. David.
Well, welcome to all of you. I'm so glad that you had a chance to see the film and can join in this discussion. And I appreciate your activism today and the past and future years. I worked as a Quaker lobbyist in Washington. I was the lobbyist against the Vietnam War from 1966 to 70. And as you may remember, at the beginning of that period, or when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, I think there were only 3 votes against it. And it was real tough sledding. I mean, all these lies were coming from the president and people getting through the media. And my job was to try to get Congress to vote against this war. And it was very, very tough. And until we started getting a movement of people across the country in their own communities and villages and towns and cities, that they began to take notice that their constituents really didn't like what was going on. It was a very serious question. So as you saw in the film, when we organized, and Robert was a part of this also, reading the names of the war dead on the Capitol steps, And the congressman joined us after we were getting arrested for several weeks. That began to get national attention and inspired people all around the country to get much more active. And I think, you know, sadly, we have another madman in the White House. And I think what we all need is hope that what we can do can make a difference. And I think this film really shows that if the people really mobilize and get active and just do not lie over, you know, lie on the side and say, well, something horrible is happening, but there's nothing we can do about it, it will happen. And we the people have the opportunity to decide whether we're going to just march straight on to World War III and keep having thousands or millions of people dying, or whether we're going to live in a peaceful and just world. So I'm so grateful for this film to help all of us to learn that lesson and to have more hope.
Yeah, thank you all. We've already had some questions come in. I actually want to start with this idea, though, of effectiveness. I very much remember when the story made its way to me about these declassified documents that showed, you know, that Nixon really cared about the peace movement and it had really impacted his behavior. And that idea that someone very late in the film, I can't remember who it was, you probably will, said something about how you won't know the impact of what you're doing when you're doing it. You may not know it for years, you may never know it, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. Doesn't mean you aren't making a huge difference. And I know that really struck me. Do any of you have more to say on that aspect? That especially, I'll say, in our culture with, you know, wanting results really soon, you know, we have such a short attention span, etc. The idea that we are putting in work that may not really bear fruit until far down the road seems to really frustrate and you know, causes some people to just give up. So I wonder if any of you have anything more to say about that aspect of this in your film.
Well, I think that's incredibly important. I think Robert and David and I would agree that's ultimately the message of the film. And Frank Joyce is the one who says that in the film. He was an anti-war organizer himself and had a long career working for the United Auto Workers Union, which, as you see in the film, was the first major union outside the sort of left unions that had opposed the war that came out against the war under Walter Reuther. So that was a very important development at the time. But yes, that's the message of the film. You know, it's like the old waiting for Godot expression. Things are so bad we can't go on, but we go on. And when we go on and we protest in our own ways, and we stand up, we say to no to injustice, it does have an impact. It does have an impact. But it's not necessarily immediate, that's for sure. It took a long time for us to stop the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, I'll add one other point, which is that it's what the government or whoever, you know, we're protesting against. What they always do is they try to minimize and just try to do everything they can to discourage people from thinking that they're having an effect. In the film, we have Nixon saying very explicitly, these demonstrations will have no effect whatsoever on what I do.
And he was enjoying the football game.
Yeah, right. And that's, you know, and that can be very, you know, discouraging, you know, thinking that, you know, it sort of ticks you off that you think that, well, this is, you know, this isn't possible and so on. Well, it isn't possible. It isn't what happened. But that kind of smoke screen, that kind of gaslighting, it's done, it's predictable. It's predictable. But you just have to, go through that. You have to expect it. And I think the other point that's really, really important to know is that one demonstration was not it. There was 10 years worth of all kinds of activity, not just major demonstrations, small ones, civil disobedience, small quiet vigils, the letter writing, petitions, the kind of work that David did. There's many, many, many things that happened, and it took a long, long time. But we could also look at just what's going on right now in Palestine, Israel. At the very beginning of, it's been going on for 75 years. It didn't start on October 7th, 23. But over the time since October 7th, there's been a real shift in public opinion, perception of what's going on. And a lot of that has to do with there's been a lot of people who've been out in the streets, writing letters, petitioning, lobbying. All these things are necessary, and they have an effect. Just takes time.
And I would just add, it's the power structure and the military industrial complex. If we do nothing, they're going to get their way, and they're going to do exactly what they want to do, which is continue to rule the world, so to speak. And greater and greater military, more and more modernizing nuclear weapons, and threatening Russia and China with nuclear war. So we, the people, are what stands between that and really a peaceful, just future for the world.
Which is a great lead into another question that Dawn has asked. What lessons for the current anti-war movements can we learn from those in the 60s? Millions marched to oppose Bush's war in Iraq to no avail. Has the government learned to suppress effective anti-war activism?
The government always knew how to suppress anti-war activism. Look what happened to the Wobblies and the anti-war movement around World War I. Enormous repression, followed during that war and right after. So the government's always had a very strong upper hand, controlling the military, police. Nixon was, very adept at repression and at divide and conquer, and things haven't gotten any easier. There are many ways to protest, and in one sense, every generation is different, and every war has its own differences and context. There are some things that never change about wars, but some things are different. And so each generation has to figure out what's an effective way to stop the war. And what might have worked at one time to shorten another war might not be the best tactic now. Those things have to be worked out by people. We're not prescriptive in this film about what should be done. There's some lessons that I think are important, which is that you try to build as broad a movement over time as you can, that nonviolence is very important, that you reach out to people to constantly attract people. You don't have such a righteous position that you're always driving people away, splintering, turning into factions, that sort of thing. That's a dead end. The people who organized this mass demonstration in Washington in November, the mobilization, and the moratorium people were very clear that they wanted to create as broad a movement as possible. And the innovation of October 15th, the moratorium, was to do demonstrations all across the country to show that it wasn't just people in San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C., where all the big marches had been held. It was people all across the country by then who were turning against the war. That was the big shocker for Nixon and the White House when they saw how many people, up to 3 million people around the country in small towns and high schools and college campuses and some workplaces, stopped and literally had a moratorium that day, and showed how many people across America at that point were against the war.
Yeah. Other thoughts on that from the panelists?
I would
Well,
just, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I would just echo that, that building a strong grassroots movement, which is not just, you know, the few peace people who've been known as peace people for the last 50 years, but reaching out to the labor unions and the students and the religious community, et cetera. So I think that one of the reporters said this, I forget what they said, but you know, the moratorium looked like it was just ordinary folks from around the country. And that's when we win.
Yeah, actually, you know, one thing that we have been looking at in the New Hampshire Peace Action Zoom series that we do is nonviolence, effective nonviolence. We've had Jamila Rakib, we've looked at Erica Chenoweth's work. So this whole new body of research that actually is sort of documenting effective nonviolence. And that's something that you didn't have in the 60s, right? This whole body of research. So that's something we have going for us now. We just got to remember that and use it. And one of the things that I know has stood out to me from that work that you just talked about was the ability for a nonviolent movement to attract a large group of people and a diverse group of people that I really saw, you know, the organizer who was saying she insisted that families feel safe coming to them, and the diversity, you know, bringing in labor, this, you know, having it be open enough to be so large, does seem to be a really important part of nonviolent action. I don't know if any of you want to...
No, absolutely. And look, the anti-war movement had a model to build on, which was the civil rights movement. And as the film shows, many people who were active in the civil rights movement, certainly Martin Luther King and Coretta King, as the film shows, you were very, very active in opposing the Vietnam War courageously. And the nonviolence and the experience of the civil rights movement was an incredible foundation for the anti-war movement that followed.
And not just in terms of I mean, it wasn't just they took that position, but also the tactics went straight from one to the other. I mean, like the thing that I actually did on the you know, for the November 15th march was to train marshals or monitors. I mean, it's called different things, but and it was an incredible story, which unfortunately we had to cut, you know, from the film. But what happened was that we were able to organize people with experience, many of whom had been involved in the civil rights movement and learned the technique, particularly of role playing, as a way of role playing, you know, confrontations, and how do you deal with the police? How do you deal with provocateurs? How do you, you know, what do you do in difficult situations? You role play this. Anyway, so there was a network of nonviolent trainers that we had come to DC, and we wound up training almost between 4,000 and 5,000 marshals for that demonstration. And we trained them actually, you know, we had a church, people would come there, and many of the recruits were people who participated in the March Against Death, you know, the march from the Pentagon to the Capitol that is described in some detail in the film. And we had our recruiters meeting people as they finished the march. Hey, would you like to be a marshal tomorrow? And so, you know, and we had this going for 24/7. Well, it was only 24/3. There was only 3 days worth, but we had, you know, for 24, you know, people would get off in the middle of the night and they go over to the church and we do the role playing, and, you know, we'd have an orientation so they understood what we were trying to do. And at the time, there was, it's sort of alluded to in the film, but the idea of violent demonstration was still very much in the air. And we mentioned in the film about how Bill Ayers had actually tried to bribe the people at the moratorium, you know, to give, what was it, $20,000, and he'd call off a demonstration at the Justice Department. But we were very concerned about people with that sort of ideology messing up the march for everybody else. And we also had, I mean, the police were serious. I mean, the military was serious. I mean, we show how they came in. So it was very important that we be disciplined. And I think that's one of the things that the civil rights movement was especially good at, was discipline, you know, trying to make sure that people understood that they were part of, you know, they were part of something larger than themselves personally, that they had to have, you know, you had to have a way of controlling your group. But anyway, that was one of the things that was very important in the success of the November 15th demonstration.
Yeah, that's, oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, Amy, I was just going to say, I can see some of the questions popping up. You know, I know there's incredible frustration now with Trump having been elected and in power. And it's very daunting and terrifying, and God knows what's going to happen. I'll flash back to the fact that even after this big successful fall 1969 series of protests that averted a real disaster in Vietnam, Nixon knew that he was not going to get reelected. He was not going to remain in power, and he wasn't going to win this war unless he took some dramatic action. And he began to do two big things. One, to end the draft, which was very unpopular. And in effect, over time, the anti-war movement ended the draft. The other thing that Nixon learned, is he could not keep 500,000 US troops, that's how many there were, fighting in Vietnam. The death toll was way too high, the injuries were way too high, and the American public was not going to stand it anymore. So he began to withdraw troops. He didn't want to, Kissinger didn't want to, but the anti-war movement and popular opinion and some pressure even within his own administration from his Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, and other Republicans and Democrats in Congress pushing him, he began to withdraw the troops. So that, you know, those troops were gone in a couple of years. And he was forced to do the peace agreement, although he did this horrible December 72 bombing right before it was signed. So, and then he was reelected. He was reelected in a landslide against a great guy, McGovern, a peace candidate. The other thing, though, was that Congress began to turn. Congress, peace candidates were elected to Congress. And of course, Nixon shot himself in the foot with Watergate, trying to repress Dan Ellsberg and break into the Democratic Party headquarters and attack the anti-war movement and the media and so forth, all his political enemies. Watergate did him in. So these things aren't easy. They're difficult, and there's a lot of back and forth movement. But the force of the anti-war movement, even though the anti-war movement, polls show, was never popular in America. The majority of Americans came to oppose the war, but they didn't, the majority of Americans, by polls anyway, say that they supported the anti-war movement. So there was always that tension too. But the force of the anti-war movement in pushing peace candidates to get elected to Congress and in not relenting on protesting the war eventually forced an end to it. Never would have happened otherwise. The war would have gone on and on. They were still supplying the regime with military weapons in Saigon, and they were still bombing. And we know what happened from their bombing of Cambodia. It turned into a genocide, a horrendous situation there. So these things are never easy. Vietnam was an enormous war, even with the wars we've had since in Iraq and Gaza and so forth, which are just god awful. Vietnam was an enormous, enormous war.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to call on some people who have their hands up. I did want to say I appreciate everything you're saying, but Robert, you're bringing up the civil rights movement. One thing that we're doing in New Hampshire, we recently had a conversation about the James Lawson's legacy. And we here have what's called the New Hampshire Peacekeeper Project, where we train people in de-escalation and other such nonviolence techniques. And we are really ramping up our training program. So that's a big goal of ours, to get a lot more people trained in these techniques and tactics and ready to use them and step in where needed. So thanks for that. The other thing, what you just said, Stephen, that the anti-war movement was never popular. One of the things that I learned from Erica Chenoweth's work that I'll just, sticks with me is that in order to, the tipping point in terms of numbers is 3% of a population being actively involved in a struggle. So we think, oh, we got to convince every single person. That's not the case. You just need to get a small group super involved, because it's not just that they agree, it's that they're really involved. But yeah, it doesn't actually, take everyone, but it does take a big chunk of folks really doing a lot of good, hard work. And I want to call on Sarah next. I'm going to have to hit a button and then you should be able to unmute, Sarah. Did that work? Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I really enjoyed this film and the discussion. I grew up in Washington and was involved in many of these demonstrations, as I lived right outside there, and I would go in. I remember walking around the White House with those buses there and chanting and shouting there. And it did. I wish this film could have gone on and continued on. I was there when my high school went on strike, because one of the people killed at Kent State had graduated from my high school, and there was that really energized, I guess you could say, a lot of people. That event, that's a very important event too. And there were some interesting tactics that went on that I don't even know if people are aware of them. Some of the demonstrations that happened in Boston, there was a demonstration that was it was a very mysterious demonstration. We were told there was trainings on how to be nonviolent, and then we were told to gather on Beacon Street, and then we were put into groups of people, and we didn't know where we were going. We were marching down Beacon Street. But it was a really clever demonstration, because what they did was they crossed over the Charles Rivers into Cambridge. Now, the Boston police were prepared for the demonstration, but the Cambridge police were not. And so then, but then we went beyond that, though. This is a really clever demonstration. There was a sort of faux demonstration on Mass Ave, and the other groups of us were told to go down the railroad tracks, and we piled all kinds of debris on the railroad tracks, because those were the tracks that they were sending stuff down, the bombing materials and the chemicals that were coming down. And No, I don't even think anybody has ever really reported on a lot of the stuff that went on during this incredible movement, and there were, people were really creative, I think, in doing these things, and the universities, of course, were incredibly involved in going, and going on strike during those times. So I, but it was one thing. It was one thing, the war, that was the main thing. And I'm puzzled now because there's so many things that are going on that that who knows what will really turn people. But certainly the police state was there then. My youth group was number 3 on Nixon's subversive list, right behind the John Birch Society. And I was interviewed by the Secret Service at one point at the age of like 17. Secret Service, not the FBI, not anything else. There was a lot of police work going on during that time, and we're seeing it again. We'll see the same thing happening again with these kind of enemy lists that are coming up, and the targeting of individuals and things like that. So I think
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sarah.
Thank you.
It seems like one thing you're talking about there was the creativity of some of the protests. I don't know if that might be something that our panelists want to speak to. And another thing that came up in the chat was about the arts, the music, the sort of breadth of ways in which people were reaching out and building the movement. Maybe that's something that you have thoughts on, guys?
Well, the music was incredibly important. It was incredibly important to the civil rights movement, and it was incredibly important to the anti-war movement. We had a soundtrack to both of those movements, and the singing, and we all know the people who were there, and you saw them in the film. Pete Seeger throughout, an absolutely phenomenal guy, and John Lennon writing "Give Peace a Chance," and then 500,000 people singing it, chanting it, right outside the White House, on the Washington Mall. So music always helps.
Great. Sounds like there's a lot more stories to be told. I'll be asking you later about your next film in a hopeful fashion. I'm gonna let Doug go next. Doug, can you there you go.
Yeah. I really appreciated the film. I was too young to go to Washington at the time, but I found ways to protest on my own as a junior high school student. And I think my father probably went. He was a Quaker activist at the time and involved in many of those events. And I was fortunate, though, to have gone to a talk that Daniel Ellsberg gave just about 10 years later when I was in college. And he first told the story of how Nixon threatened to bomb Vietnam and to set off a nuclear explosion, and that the anti-war movement really stopped him from that madness. And I was surprised that I hadn't seen the film before, because I watch almost all the American Experience films on PBS. And I checked the dates, and it turned out I was actually in Vietnam at the time that it aired. I can report briefly that the country has recovered quite a bit, although, of course, there's still lasting damage. But it was certainly pleasing that the people there that we met didn't harbor anger toward us for the American war, as they call it. One thing, though, that struck me, or I was reminded in the film, was the curious incident where Richard Nixon went out into the mall in the middle of the night to talk to some protesters. And I couldn't recall whether that was a later event at a later protest or whether it didn't fit into your narrative of the
It was
film.
later. It was later,
Okay.
Doug. That came the following year or year after that. I will say one thing. That's great that you were in Vietnam. It's amazing people there. Our film, The Movement, The Madman, was just shown in Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was broadcast. They asked to broadcast it. They licensed it from PBS, and they showed it on the largest television network in Vietnam in prime time to the whole country. Translated it, of course, into Vietnamese.
Mhm.
So I'm very proud that the film was shown there.
Great, great.
That's amazing. Do Robert or David want to say anything?
Oh,
Okay.
next question.
Yeah, I do see your hand done, but I did want to pull in a couple that were in the chat, have been in the chat for a while. Evelyn was wondering this. Why do we have to protest at all? That war and killing is wrong should be self-evident. How can Biden have been saying peace at church while sending weapons to Israel? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the other side is very well organized. I mean, it's not. I mean, I think everybody in this group probably understands this, but I mean, it's so clear that there is a military, industrial, congressional complex that is dedicated to war, and that there's no way that you can just simply wish it away. It's just because something's right doesn't mean everybody does what's right. And many people, I mean, I think the most reprehensible person to my mind in the Biden administration was Blinken, because he just lied blatantly, almost every time he opened his mouth. And people, not everybody has the same standards of honesty and truth. And so I think that's what a lot of the point of demonstrations is to, as the old saying goes, speak truth to power.
I'm sure this is getting far afield from our film, but I'm sure many or maybe all of you saw the Episcopal Bishop of Washington speak some truth to power in her sermon in the National Cathedral, speaking directly to Trump and Vance sitting right in front of her in the pews.
And I think you mentioned that one of Stephen's films was the best politicians money can buy, something like that. And that is our problem. Money is buying the politicians these days. We have a White House and a Congress that are beholden to their funders rather than to the American people. Until that is rectified, democracy is not possible. But I just wanted to say a couple things that from a comment on what's been said. One, something that we have that we did not have in the 60s and 70s is social media. And we have a group here in Northern California that has been blocking workers going in to load bombs on the planes going to Israel to drop on Gaza. We call it a people's arms embargo. And we've been doing that for the last year or so, getting arrested and beaten up sometimes by the police. But now, starting February 23rd, I mean, mainstream media didn't really hardly carry what we're doing, but it's been on social media exactly what we were doing. And on February 23rd, there's going to be a people's arms embargoes happening all over the country and other parts of the world, where people got inspired by what we were doing, and since Congress and the president aren't instituting a national arms embargo, This is a people's arms embargo. So that's a great asset that we have. And I just wanted to say, if you need some hope, look at nonviolent news. And Rivera's son, who lives next door to you in Maine, puts out every week stories of nonviolent actions and movements all around the world that are successful. 50 every week. And so important. And then there's a website called Waging Nonviolence, where there are a bunch of great articles that can inspire you about, again, what people are actually not just talking nonviolence, they're building nonviolent movements to help bring about the massive change that is needed for a just and peaceful world.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing up both of those great resources. Absolutely, I think much of the media is really happy to feed us the terrible stories, the horrifying things going on in the world, and make us feel incredibly powerless. And I don't think that's serving us very well to only look at that. So I think this, seeing what's working is incredibly important. I want to ask one question more from the chat, and then I'll call on some people. Sarah says, I work in documentaries as an archival producer, so I appreciate the historic media so much. My question is, does the country have the same appetite for social justice as they did in the 1960s? If we did, it seems we wouldn't have Trump as president for the second time after all of his corruption is clearly exposed. What do you think of that?
Well, the largest demonstrations that have ever happened in America have happened very recently. I mean, the George Floyd demonstrations were multiple times larger than the largest in Vietnam or any other time in American history. And the Women's March in 2017, same thing, huge. There are, again, the forces of the right and the forces of reaction are very strong right now. It's absolutely true, but we shouldn't think of it as like, do we win in the short term? I mean, I really do believe in what Martin Luther King said. That the arc of history is in our favor, and I think that's you just have to have faith at some level, and also assume you're going to lose most of the time. I mean, and our film. I mean, the whole point of our film, is that you never know. I mean, what Frank Joyce said. You may not know for years, decades, as to what actually the impact that you're having, but you are having an impact, and you're having an impact even if you keep losing.
Either anyone else want to speak to that? I think that was.
Amen.
Yeah, I was going to say, well said. Dawn, I am going to ask you to unmute, see if that works, and you can go ahead.
Okay, good, thanks. Just following up on what the person just said, the previous speaker was David. Anyway, it's not just right wing. The Democrats are probably more pro-war than Republicans now, but that's just an aside. In the 60s, there was the draft, and that helped mobilize millions of Americans because they had skin in the game. Now there's no draft. Furthermore, the government, first of all, it's mostly foreigners dying. And if Americans do die, they don't show the coffins coming back. So the costs of all these wars are hidden. It's mostly foreigners doing it. And the propaganda has gotten so bad that a lot of people in this call probably think the war in Ukraine is the US is innocent and that it wasn't engineered by the CIA. Where the truth is that the US engineered that war in Ukraine too, just like they engineered the ones all over, all these wars. So I wanted you to comment, getting back, it's sort of a depressing point is, how can we, in the present time, how can we make the cost of these wars evident? Maybe we need a draft. I don't really think we do need a draft, but the costs are hidden. So I just wanted to comment on that. I know it's just it's a long, the arc of history is very, very long, but I think it moves towards justice slower than I thought it did. Thanks.
Thanks, Don. Reactions to what Don has raised?
Every war, just to go back to something I say, this is not a profound statement, but every period of history, every war has its differences. And you're right, there is no draft, and the costs of these wars have been hidden to a great extent. I mean, the number of Americans who died in Afghanistan and Iraq, as horrendous as those were for the people there, above all, but for the Americans who were fighting, their ongoing effects of those wars, trauma, brain damage, etc., horrible, horrible things. But the casualties, the number of dead, were far below what happened in Vietnam. And there was no draft. People were in this horrible situation where they joined the National Guard, and the next thing they knew, they would be in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then their time was up and they'd be forced to stay and renew. It wasn't like Vietnam where you knew you were in for a year and a half and that was it if you were drafted. So there are lots of problems in the current situation, but people have to find creative, effective ways to try to put an end to the wars that we want to be over so desperately.
Yeah, Robert or David, do you want to add?
I think that the draft did confront every young man in the 60s. Can I, in conscience, participate in this business of killing massive numbers of men, women, and children in Vietnam? Many of them didn't even know they had that choice, but that did encourage, tens of thousands of people leave the country to refuse and go to a prison to do alternative service. But we still do have a draft, and I don't support returning to the draft. I mean, the kind of propaganda and the dehumanizing of people about not thinking about other people as human beings, etc. But we do still have a draft of our money. Every American is forced to pay 50% of their taxes to go for killing people, and many of us are refusing, resisting at least. And here in California, there is now a court case where tax resistors are suing their congressional representatives for listening to the arms manufacturers rather than their constituents. And that started out with just 2 counties here in Northern California. Now it's California-wide, and I hope that this might happen nationally. We need to resist. And mass media is still brainwashing people. And somehow we have to encourage our neighbors and friends, colleagues who are buying the poison, so to speak, to kind of look beyond to where they can get some more accurate information about what's really going on with our tax dollars.
Yeah, thank you.
Amy, I will say just one other thing here. This is the 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam, 50 years ago, ended May 1975. So this year, in the midst of everything else that's going on in the world and dealing with this Trump administration, there are going to be, in Vietnam and here and other places in the world, a number of memorials and commemorations and reflection upon the war, what it meant, how we got into it, why. It's a very important time for education. And we're making a big effort to try to get PBS. This was first shown, our film on American Experience, the PBS series, in 2023. A number of stations have re-aired it since. We're trying to get PBS to run it again nationally this spring. That'll probably happen. But stations on their own initiative are also just rerunning it. It aired on Inauguration Day, this Monday, kind of counter inaugural programming in Kentucky on the big public TV station in Louisville, Kentucky. They ran The Boys Who Said No at 8 o'clock and The Movement and the Madman at 9 o'clock, prime time. So we are going to make a big effort to get the film out. We appreciate any help in that to get it shown as widely as possible. It's available on PBS Passport, on Amazon Prime, on the library service Canopy. We want to try to, Robert and I and David have gone in a number of places, from the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco to different college campuses and community groups to show it. And we want to get it out there and discussed as widely as possible in connection with this 50th anniversary year.
And just aside, the Veterans for Peace is organizing a delegation to go to Vietnam, end of April, early May. And I've been there with also with Veterans for Peace several years ago. But I think it's important that more people go and really understand the pain and the suffering which we caused in what they call the American War, and they're still suffering, and feel the strength and courage of those people, even in the face of the massive bombing of the U.S., to keep going, not to give up.
Thank you. I was gonna ask JJ's question, but I see JJ's hand is up. So why don't we, I'm gonna see if you can unmute. Did that work, JJ? I'm gonna try once more here.
Go. I
Yeah.
think I got okay. So yeah, I'm also a longtime peace activist, including all the way back to 1965 when first Quaker demonstration in Lafayette Park. I am impressed because by 69, I think I had already mostly given up on big demonstrations because of the sense that we weren't making progress, and so just doing things like, you know, civil disobedience of one sort or another was where we had to go. But I never felt like that was necessarily moving the needle. And what I felt moved the needle most was the draft counseling and then roping in the Vietnam veterans against the war to everything. And they were mentioned in the film, but I don't think very prominently. And in terms of changing the minds of middle America, I think they may have had more effect than people like you and I refusing the draft. But I wonder what we can find that's equivalent to begin changing the mind of middle America about the military industrial complex that has gotten so much huger than we ever thought it would get. It was already bad back in the 60s, and now it's like, my God, it's got its tentacles into everything. And how do we get people to begin to see that? Do we have anything equivalent that we can imagine to the Vietnam veterans against the war?
Excuse me. I'd like to say a couple things in response to what you said. One is that the VVAW, Vietnam veterans, that really didn't get very large until 2 years after the events of our film. And actually, Steve did a mini doc about that himself in 71. What we have in the film is really the biggest manifestation of the Vietnam vets at that time in 69. You know, they participated as a separate group in the march in November. But I think your other points about how let's see, I'm forgetting how you put it about the other let's see, remind me what you your point about how do we get something that's comparable? I think you have to go to what Steve said already, that everything that we fight against is different. And the military industrial complex, I think that a lot about nonviolent actions have to do with dramatizing something that's evil or wrong and figuring out how to essentially make a story about it. I think that's a lot of, the genius of nonviolent action is that, I mean, you look at the civil rights movement, you look at, what we did in the Vietnam War, sort of, I mean, like, I think one of the most creative things in the Vietnam War was the March Against Death, to actually to show that these individuals were dying, or, or what David's role in the film was about talking about the reading the names on the war dead, another creative thing. I think that all of these things have to, but it's always going to be chipping away. There's not going to be, to use baseball, it's not going to be home runs. It's going to be lots of singles if we do it right. But it's going to be a cumulative thing that takes a lot of time. And we're fighting a really, really incredibly uphill battle. I mean, the amount of money that's devoted to, just the lobbying alone is unbelievable. The amount of lobbying that is done by the war makers, that they have, using our tax dollars. I mean, it's just horrendous, the way that the system is right now. But I think that people have to stand up, and it's just going to take a long, long time to turn things around. But there's always, what happens though is that lots of times there's a tipping point, that all of a sudden all this activity that seems to be not having any effect whatsoever, all of a sudden it does have an effect. Or you don't even know what the effect is, because the people on the other side are always trying to make it seem like it's insignificant. And I'm sorry you got discouraged, halfway through it, but you weren't the only one. But fortunately, there were other people that hadn't got discouraged yet. They joined in. I mean, that's what movements are. Movements are not static things. They attract new blood all the time. That's what makes them so powerful.
I'll just add this. I think that was JJ really interesting comment. And as Robert said, I did make a short film for VVAW about their demonstration in Washington. It was in the spring of '71. So it was beyond the scope of our film. It was, as Robert said, 2 years later. And what we showed in the film was really the early efforts of the anti-war movement to reach out to soldiers and to veterans of the war, contrary to the big stereotype, which is that, we were spitting on soldiers coming home and so forth, the whole kind of Rambo backlash against the anti-war movement. That was really effective anti-war movement propaganda that hit America. We lost the war, but suddenly we're winning the war with Rambo. It's weird. But those VVAW guys, and when they camped out on the mall and they threw their medals away on the steps of the Capitol, and they went into Congress and testified, including John Kerry, who was very, very effective at that time. Mm-hmm. That was really important. And you could see it in '69 that the organizers of the march let a delegation of active duty GIs lead that march. And there was Coretta King and William Sloane Coffin and lots of people, celebrities, McGovern linking arms in the front. And then there was this delegation of active duty GIs, and behind them, veterans. So the anti-war movement, in fact, was really reaching out and trying to make that connection. And Pete Singer was, singing "Bring 'Em Home" from the stage in front of 500,000 people. But that really took off then when VVAW formed and, began its protest. So what do you do now? I mean, there is no draft, as someone has said. These wars are fought more and more with planes and drones. People are conducting the bombing from bunkers, remotely. But there's still a real toll that soldiers, that combatants face, and come back and are embittered about the war. You know, we went to war to find weapons of mass destruction. It turns out that was a complete lie. Well, then those people have to live with that lie. Approaching people and being able to talk through that is really an important thing for the peace movement to do.
Yeah, thanks. David, did you want to?
And I, perhaps you already know, but Veterans for Peace today is doing a lot of very courageous and effective actions. And I forget the name of it, but there's another organization of veterans from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars that are also, speaking out very strongly. But for those that may not know about it, check out World Beyond War. There are people all over the world that are working actively to end war as an institution, which obviously is not getting security for anybody. But there are workshops, there's books, radio programs, a lot of excellent resources for people that don't know about that and want to be encouraged about whether others are doing what we can do.
Yeah, thank you. We're here in New Hampshire. We're in the home state of Granny D, if folks know, who worked really hard, walked across the country for campaign finance reform. And we have a lot of programs on, and essentially the movement for democracy in this country, which we really feel like will make a lot of the other things that we care about much easier to actually achieve. So that's sort of the structural change that we're hoping to get moving as well. In terms of tipping points, I think one thing that's interesting, I think some of us do feel like we've hit a tipping point in terms of the Palestinian rights issue. I know folks who are on this call who have worked on the issue of Israel and Palestine for 30 years and have been pretty much ostracized for it until recently. I'm part of a group that is out in the streets weekly, and we get way more thumbs up than thumbs down, and I did not expect that. So there are things changing. It isn't always a straight line, and it isn't always clear. And I'm noticing in the chat that people are asking, well, it seems that maybe marches don't work, demonstrations don't work, maybe BD, would you say that maybe it's a little bit of everything? And the more creative and the more, new tactics we can bring, the better. But is it hard? It seems hard to me to decide any one thing doesn't work. Seems like it's these combinations that it's not an either or kind of a thing. It's a yes and. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'm primarily a filmmaker and a journalist, but I'll weigh in and say it's a yes and. There isn't one silver bullet, bad metaphor there. There isn't one single way to stop wars and to end injustice, but it all adds up. It all adds up. Some things are more effective and targeted. And as we keep saying, it's a time to be creative, to try to figure out what does work. And it's going to be a lot of different things, in my opinion. I do believe that demonstrations still have an impact.
And I think if you look at the encampments that happened last spring at college campuses all across this country and universities, I mean, that was one of the most hopeful things that's happened in this country in a long time. And I spent some time visiting some of those with the people, and they'll never be the same again. I mean, they have a deeper understanding of the world we live in, and that they have some power to create change. And of course, the power structure has, including the university power structures, have clamped down on that. But, you know, we just need to be creative and find alternative ways to keep speaking out. But I mean, some of us who are older think, well, you know, where are the young people? Well, they are awake. We just need to reach out to them and become allies.
One thing I do think is in terms of what we have going for us, and we don't have as many veterans, we don't have the draft in quite the same, you know, so it's not hitting the US population in the same way. However, there is the growing understanding that war is utterly devastating to the environment and the climate. And I think a lot of young people are really invested in the climate justice movement. And we've had a lot of good things happen in this state in terms of reaching out and working with groups that have environmental and climate justice at their core. They've been wanting to join us and we've been wanting to help them. And maybe some of those, you know, as we say, intersectional issues of today are in that realm.
But I'll add one more point, is that if you actually look at what happened within the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, it started with education. You know, the teach-ins were really the basis for a lot of the student activism that happened, and the beginning to educate people, you know, beyond the campuses. But I think that education, you just can't underestimate it. It's sort of, you know, somebody asked earlier about, you know, it's sort of self-evident that war is bad and it's all that. But it's not necessarily self-evident, let's say, like the point I mentioned earlier, about the way that our tax dollars are being spent to help the people lobby to get more weapons. I mean, there are so many facets of how the system is corrupt and awful that it's really, you know, we need to can't assume that people know all this. I mean, sometimes we get into a bubble that we think everybody knows about what's really going on. Well, that isn't true. I was in Palestine actually in November, and I know it was eye-opening to me, all the things that I didn't realize. You know, I thought I knew a lot about what was going on over there, but it's really, you know, much worse. And so I'm dedicating a fair amount of my time right now to trying to educate people about it. Because I think that if people really knew how horribly the Israelis are, I mean, it's a police state. I mean, it's just horrendous. I mean, in the West Bank, which is where I was, I mean, it's really, you know, apartheid is only the half of it. You know, it's also that it's very sadistic the way that the Palestinians are treated on so many levels. And, you know, that I think that if people begin to understand more and more about, let's say, just on that one issue, that's going to have an effect over time. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, like in my district in you know, in the Santa Cruz, California area, there's a great change in what's happened, you know, in terms of the public on that issue. But our congressman got $250,000. Jimmy Panetta got $250,000 from AIPAC, just from AIPAC. And that's a hard thing to overcome. But, you know, more and more people, you know, eventually maybe this guy should be kicked out. I mean, this, you know, it's got to, you know, we need education. I think it's just such a crucial thing in terms of ultimately having an impact.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I wanted to mention that in the chat, there's been a lot of notes, including some resources, ways to learn more about things like the Taxpayers Against Genocide California case, which looks like it's coming to Massachusetts. And there's going to be trainings on that. So yeah, education and spreading the word and working together to inspire each other to use other creative methods are definitely out there. We are winding down. I see Bill's hand. Bill, can I hope, do you have something quick? I'm gonna let you unmute. Just note, it's good.
I was just going to call attention to the international dimension. We have a sense from the social media that there's a lot of young youth activism, but also a lot of youth repression, particularly in Germany. You can actually demonstrate with more freedom here than in Germany. Not sure about France. Spain and Ireland have been pushing back. So did you have that sense of international support in the anti-war movement in the late 60s?
Well, I'll tell you one story. Yes, look, there were a friend of mine was an aide, believe it or not, having graduated from Haverford, to Bertrand Russell, who was the philosopher, of course, old man by the time the war in Vietnam was going on, but he organized the Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal. And it was, considered just commie propaganda in the United States at first, but he recruited Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre and other dignitaries from around the world. And in a way, that set the model for war crimes investigations ever since, including current ones. So even though that seemed like really out there, it had an impact over time, I would say. But look, there were big demonstrations against the US war in Vietnam in Europe. It was big demonstrations in Germany and France and England, in Japan, in 1968 in particular. There were kind of young anti-war protesters all over the world. It was a really big phenomenon. And I'll tell you one other very specific story in the moratorium. This is kind of funny, but one of the big demonstrations overseas, it was not the focus of the moratorium, but was a demonstration in London in front of the US Embassy. And that attracted quite a few people. The actor Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were big supporters of the moratorium. They happened to be in London at the time promoting a film, and they marched in the demonstration outside the US Embassy. One of the people involved in that was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton had, as there's a brief mention in our film, he became friends with this organizer, David Mixner, and he hung around the moratorium offices for a while. He was an aide of Fulbright, an intern, and he, was overseas in college in London and came down and demonstrated. And then flash forward many years, you may recall that when he was running for president, George Bush Sr. Brought that up and said, he didn't think it was appropriate for an American to be demonstrating overseas against in front of a US embassy. It didn't get very far in the campaign, but it was a George Bush talking point against Clinton in the '92 presidential race.
Wow, interesting. So much that we could talk about. I'm gonna start wrapping up here though. Wow, this really was a rich discussion, and I'm glad that we had an hour and a half for the panel discussion and let you all watch the film another time, because we couldn't have sat here for 3 hours, right? So here's my kind of last question to you guys. Is there going to be another film?
Honestly, no, not immediately. I mean, our focus really this year is going to be, look, making a film is especially if you're working as independents, as we are. I used to work for Frontline, and there was a budget. You do one film right after the other one. But working as independents, it's hard. I mean, Robert and some other people made this film possible, much to their everlasting credit. But there are limits on resources. So our focus this year is in getting this film out and seen as widely as possible, and having discussions like this prompted by the film, which we think are very helpful and very valuable. someday maybe another film. Well, I'd love to, but the focus now is on distributing this one.
Great. Well, and I do want, in case people aren't aware, that there is the other film, the Boys Who Said No. So both of them are amazing, and we have shown both of them, and we hope that you all will get them out to your communities as well. And actually, which I pulled out a quote that just kept coming to me while we were talking tonight. This is a Rachel Corrie quote. People know Rachel Corrie, who was killed defending homes in, I think she was in the West Bank, right? Killed by,
Gaza.
she was in Gaza. Okay, I couldn't remember. Thank you. We've read this at a lot of our vigils and events this year, so I'm going to quickly share it with you. Rachel Corrie said, "The international media and our government are not going to tell us that we are effective, important, justified in our work, courageous, intelligent, valuable. We have to do that for each other. One way we can do that is continuing our work visibly. And of course, another way we can do it is by coming together, watching films, learning about other movements, and educating and talking and holding each other up." And let me close with a few words about upcoming programming. We hope you'll stay in touch with us, nhpeaceaction.org. We're also on Facebook. Our Ceasefire Now vigils are continuing even in this bitter cold. I don't think my fingers have warmed up from this afternoon, but tomorrow, Thursday, January 23rd, noon to 1, City Plaza, Concord, New Hampshire. Then next Wednesday, January 29th, 2 to 3 p.m. we'll be at Representative Pappas's office in Dover. Our next Peace and Justice conversation will be a New Hampshire Peace Action update and feedback session on Monday, January 27, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Zoom. I also wanted to flag for you that we have a special program on Thursday, February 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, also on Zoom, featuring author and journalist Peter Beinart. He's going to talk about his new book, which is called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. I'm going to put in the chat a way to contribute. This was free, and most of our programming is, but we also always welcome your support, nhpeaceaction.org/donate. And then I really just want to thank Robert, Stephen, and David for taking this time, for making the film, being in the film, for all the incredible work, and then for taking tonight to talk with us and deepen our understanding of those times and these times and the work that we are all engaged in. So, like, super visible here. Let's thank them so much. And
thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks everyone for coming. And we hope to see you again really soon.
Thank you. We can all inspire each other.